February night, north of Japan in a storm. The engine of a giant container ship suddenly shuts down, on its own, without warning, and a countdown begins. The fuel in this ship's pipes is heated to 130 degrees. And the moment it cools, it sets solid. Then the ship stops being a ship. The crew needed 3 minutes to get power back. 3 minutes! But in those 3 minutes, the vessel turned broadside to the waves. And 260 containers went over the side, while another 65 were crushed right there on deck. And here's the real question. What broke? Nothing. The investigation found no failure at all. The engine was shut down by its own safety system. And that system worked exactly as designed. Subscribe right now so you don't lose this channel. Every week we crack open another industry nobody thinks about. And while you're here, write in the comments how much fuel you think a ship like this burns in a single day. The answer is at the end and almost nobody guesses it. Let's start with the obvious question. Why don't these giants run on diesel, like trucks? The answer is brutally simple. Money. Fuel is the single largest operating cost for a shipping company. And margins in container shipping are thin. And here's where the thing we covered in our gasoline video comes in. When crude oil is distilled, it separates into fractions. At the top, the light and expensive stuff, gasoline, kerosene, diesel. And at the very bottom of the column sits what's essentially good for almost nothing, a thick black residue. Heavy fuel oil, what's left over once everything valuable has been taken. And this leftover, which nobody really knows what to do with, costs a fraction of diesel. Someone looked at it and said, let's burn this in ship engines. And so marine fuel was born, what sailors simply call bunkers. But cheap comes at a price. This fuel does not flow. At room temperature, heavy fuel oil is closer to road tar than to a liquid. You can't just pour it in and switch on a pump. Nothing will move. So the fuel tanks on board are heated permanently, around the clock. The fuel is kept at roughly 40 degrees just to stay pumpable at all. And before it reaches the engine, it's heated far more, to around 120–130 degrees. Here's why. So the injector can atomize it into a fine mist. If the fuel is too thick, it won't atomize. It will spit out as a stream. And instead of clean combustion, you get soot, deposits, and a wrecked engine. Engineers measure this as viscosity and keep it below a strict threshold. Only then does injection work properly. Which leads to a rule that sounds insane to any car driver. On a ship, the fuel must never be allowed to cool. Shut everything down and let the system go cold. And the oil congeals in the pipes and filters like cold fat in a frying pan. That's why there's an entire system of heaters, separators, and heated pipelines that keeps running even when the ship is sitting still. Now, the scale that makes all of this worth tolerating. The engine of the largest container ships isn't a motor, it's a building. A 14-cylinder marine engine weighs around 2,300 tons, stands about as tall as a 4-story house and runs nearly 30 meters long. Output: over 100,000 horsepower. A single cylinder is taller than a man, and you can walk inside the piston space standing upright. And this monster burns up to 250 tons of fuel per day at full load, not liters, tons. Over a year, an engine like this can consume something in the order of 40 to 50 million liters. Fuel tanks on the big ships hold many thousands of tons because refueling in every port makes no sense. Fuel costs differently in different countries, and captains bunker where it's cheapest: Singapore, Rotterdam, Fujairah. It's an industry of its own, called bunkering, and the price per ton moves daily like a stock quote. And now something almost nobody knows. Today you can't sail everywhere on the same fuel. From the 1st of January 2020, the entire world fleet was required to cut the sulfur content of its fuel from 3.5% to 0.5%. That single change slashed sulfur oxide emissions from shipping by around 70%. But there are zones where the rules are far stricter. They're called emission control areas: the Baltic, the North Sea, the coasts of the United States and Canada, 200 nautical miles out, the Caribbean. There, the limit is just 0.1%. What does that mean in practice? That a modern ship carries several different grades of fuel on board, and the crew switches between them along the route. Crossing the ocean, burn the cheap stuff. Approaching Europe or the American coast, switch to the clean, expensive grade. The procedure is timed to the minute because you can't change fuel abruptly. Different temperature and viscosity can thermally shock the entire fuel system. There's a second option. Some owners fitted scrubbers to their funnels, essentially giant exhaust washing machines. They strip sulfur out of the exhaust gases, which lets the ship keep burning cheap, heavy fuel even where it's formally banned. They're not installed out of love for the planet, but out of arithmetic. A scrubber costs millions, but the price gap between fuels pays it back in a couple of years. Others switch to liquefied natural gas, which has almost no sulfur at all. And now the interesting part. What happens when all of this fails? Let's go back to the case we opened with. The ship was the Maersk Eindhoven. The engine stopped because the oil pressure safety triggered. The automation shuts the engine down instantly to save it from destroying itself. Which sounds sensible, and in port that logic would save millions. But in a storm, mid-ocean, a ship without propulsion stops answering the rudder. It swings broadside to the waves and starts rolling so violently that no lashing holds. 3 minutes, and the cargo is gone. And it wasn't an isolated case. On the container ship, Maersk Sana, an explosion tore through the engine room. 3 seafarers were injured and the vessel was left adrift in the Atlantic, roughly 250 nautical miles east of Bermuda. On another ship, the Maersk Patras, the engine room caught fire off the Canary Islands. The crew fought it themselves and made it into port. The engine room is the most dangerous place on any ship. Red-hot pipes carrying pressurized fuel, hot metal, and oil, all in one space. A single crack in a fuel line is enough to spray hot, atomized fuel onto a hot surface, and you have a blowtorch. That's why these compartments have fire systems that flood the space and displace all the oxygen. The crew is counted out by head before it's released, because anyone left inside dies along with the fire. And one more thing people rarely think about. A ship cannot stop. A giant container vessel at full speed needs several kilometers and more than 10 minutes to kill its momentum. It doesn't break, it coasts. Which is why losing control in a port or a strait almost always ends in a collision. There is simply nowhere to put the ship. So, the answer to the question from the beginning. How much does a ship like this burn in a day? Up to 250 tons. That's roughly the fuel tanks of 7,000 or 8,000 cars in a single day of sailing. And despite that, a container ship is still the most efficient transport on the planet. Measured per ton of cargo per kilometer, it beats any truck and any aircraft, simply because it carries 20,000 containers at once. That's the whole story. The dirtiest, cheapest sludge left at the bottom of the oil column moves 90% of world trade. Almost everything in your home arrived on that black residue. If you enjoyed this, hit that like button and tell me in the comments which machine we should take apart next. Subscribe. Next week, we crack open another industry nobody thinks about. See you there.